as I mentioned earlier, will G20 summit, will it see any agreement on reforming multilateral lending organizations like the IMF and the World Bank? That's going to be a topic of discussion as well. And Jessica, I'd like to ask this question to you as well. Will the G20 summit see any agreement on reforming these multilateral lending organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank?
So I don't have any direct insight into the type of language that could wind up in the communique in respect with that, but I do think you'll see some nod in the communique to support for that, given the focus that India has taken on that. I also think you're going to hear, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. talk about what it's doing, use that as leverage to call on the rest of the more wealthier countries in the G20 to do their part, and use as an example countries like Sri Lanka, that of course is spending 70% of its revenue on servicing just the interest alone on the debt that it's incurred. So there are certainly cautionary tales to talk about that have direct relation and import to the countries of the G20.
Right. Siddhant, same question to you. What's your take on this?
Well, if we talk about the reforms of multilateral organizations, whether it's political organizations like the UN or whether it is the economic organizations like the World Bank or IMF, there has been a strong focus from India's side. Now, what G20 decides is something that will be an ongoing process. Not that there haven't been previous conversations as well, but more and more what India has been emphasizing on is that if reforms do not take place in these groupings, which were essentially products of 1940s after the World War I and World War II, then there will be emergence of new groupings and new bodies like the NDB Bank, like the BRICS, like the SCO, and that makes other groupings much more irrelevant at a time when there are new powers rising. So the G20 countries are acutely aware of this, but how they will work together in forming consensus is a difficult task. Remember, negotiations aren't easy always with so many diverse set of countries and diverse set of interests. The interest of the global south, the interest of the global north, and coming to even having a consensus on a single line takes many days. So the reforms are an ongoing process. The countries are aware that a reform needs to be taken, but in what format, in what direction it needs to be taken is something which of course is painful and a time-consuming process.
Right. Now, Siddhant, we're also seeing Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina at the venue to be greeted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We also saw bilateral between the two last evening. What can you tell us of some of the key highlights from that bilateral? We can see that Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is at the Bharat Mandapam, the summit venue.
One thing I would like to begin with is that India has invited Bangladesh as a country to attend the G20's the summit proceedings here in Delhi. In the region, in South Asian region, Bangladesh is the only country. And why Bangladesh? Because of the strong relationship between the two countries and the governments. Sheikh Hasina is seen as a friend of India, and during her tenure, there are elections as well. We have seen a lot of focus on connectivity. Now, yesterday there was a bilateral, there was a readout as well by the Indian side, but apart from leaders level conversation, the focus from both sides is to how to deal with the issue of counter-terrorism. There is this Teesta water issue as well, which Bangladesh has been focusing a lot and calling for early resolution. The Rohingya crisis, another concern for Bangladesh, in which Bangladesh wants India's support, but largely it's the people-to-people relationship. Remember, Indian mission in Dhaka gives the largest number of visas, Indian visas, anywhere in the world. It's a big high commission, and of course it gives visas. And why these visas to Bangladeshis? Because many of the Bangladeshis come to India for various reasons, whether it's education or whether it is going to the hospitals as well.
Right. Also, we just saw Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi arrive at the venue as well. And there we have a Prime Minister of Mauritius, Pravind Kumar Jugnauth, also arriving at the Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi. For the most part, we've seen most of the G20 members and the invitees, they've started to arrive at the venue. Now, Siddhant, let's also talk about a little bit about the sessions that have been planned for the day. What can you tell us about the first session that's supposed to focus on climate action? Do you think we can see the G20 members reach a consensus on climate action?
Well, consensus on climate action is a very, very broad topic. Whether it's these climate summits which happen almost every year. This year it will be hosted by UAE, or whether it is the big divide between the global south and the global north. Now, countries like India and China have been asking the Western countries to contribute more to the financing of climate change in terms of technology transfers. But these countries are asking countries like India and China to do more on dealing with pollution. India has taken a major lead, especially when it comes to coming up with renewable solution. India has been focusing on solar power a lot, and International Solar Alliance is one such example of it, which is led by India with participation of over 100 countries. Now, when it comes to India's proposals during this year's summit, it is the International Biofuel Alliance, in which India is keen that biofuels are used at a time when there are countries who want to fulfill their energy needs without being politically dependent on other countries. Now, crude oil is an important commodity, and we know the dynamics involving crude oil, especially the political dynamics, but now focus is to use biofuels.
Right, and there we also see Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte at the Bharat Mandapam being greeted by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Right. Now, Jessica, let me also ask you, debt financing and restructuring issues, which China, of course, is not comfortable with getting included in the joint statement. What do you have to say about that?
I actually have a question for you, if I may. I'm watching Prime Minister Modi greet all of these leaders, and I just wonder what that feels like for you as a person from India, because I think this is really the moment, right? That so many Indians have been waiting for, and I'm just watching him be, head of state, head of G20, and greeting leaders from around the world. This is huge.
I mean, it's a moment of great pride and honor for me as well to be sitting here with you, to be covering this. And of course, as we get the visuals that are coming in, it's of course an exhilarating experience, to say the least. Coming back to the debt restructuring questions now.
Back to the job, right?
Right. Some hard-hitting questions, but I mean, it has to be discussed.
Sorry, the question again was about debt restructuring?
Debt restructuring. What's your take on this? I mean, of course, this is something that China is not in favor of being included in the joint statement as well. So what's your take on this entire situation?
Well, I think China may benefit, really, from some of the language in terms of its own debt to the IMF and some of its funding. But certainly there is a resistance there. I do think it's going to come out in some form or fashion. They'll find their way through, as of course they have done with Ukraine in the past, because it's a huge issue, especially with India being the host, with India making it a big issue. I think it's really important that it does wind up in the final communique.
Right. Let's also go across to Molly Gambhir, who is, of course, also at the Bharat Mandapam. Now, Molly, again, the sessions are about to begin. We've been seeing G20 members and invitees. They've started arriving at the venue. It's an action-packed day, to say the least. And we've been seeing Prime Minister Narendra Modi greeting all of the G20 members. Let's talk about the sessions a little bit as well. First up, on climate action, I asked this to Siddhant as well. What are your expectations? What's your assessment on the language that is to be adopted on climate action?
Well, the issue of bridging those differences and actually filling those gaps has been talked about time and again in the build-up to the G20 summit as well, not just to do with climate action, but a wide range of issues, and which is why India's responsibility as the G20 president has been of utmost significance, like we discussed just a short while back, given the challenges and the time at which India took over the presidency. But talking specifically about the way in which it has been building consensus on not just the issue of climate action, but also issues which have been a direct fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war. That has been the prime focus area as far as India's negotiations are concerned as well. As we were discussing the joint declaration language when it comes to the Ukraine war as well, that it remains a big question as well. And talking about about whether or not there will be consensus as far as the climate action issue is concerned. The fact is that India has made those concerted efforts to also put out a message that it's equal participation as far as meeting this global challenge is concerned, and the countries have to at least come forward in an equitable way to try and find a resolution to this crisis. Also talking about how there is a need for countries to come together and fill in those gaps, not just in the way the countries have been meeting those challenges domestically, but also to find a global resolution and arrive at a consensus on that front, and which is why we've seen the statements coming in from the UN chief, for example, talking about divisions among the member countries. And that remains another key question mark over whether or not the countries will be able to bridge those differences and find common ground as far as the urgent challenge of climate crisis is concerned. Because let's face it, this is something that has been talked about not just in the run-up to the G20 summit, but every time we see a global forum discussing the issue, the number one question is, are countries taking the issue seriously enough, and are those responsible for most of those emissions actually sharing responsibility more than the others or not? And that is something that India has very prominently made clear as part of its efforts to find those points, in fact, being addressed, and also to find common ground on that issue.
Right, absolutely, Molly. Also, we're getting visuals now of UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan at the venue. There he's being greeted by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well. Now, coming back to you, Siddhant, what can you tell us about the UAE's priorities? Of course, we spoke about the rail link as well. What can you tell us?
Well, India and UAE relationship, if I start speaking about it, I can write a book essentially as to how the relationship has turned around when it comes to this government. We know that the Indian Prime Minister has been to UAE several times, including earlier this year, where their big announcement was made on trading in national currencies between the two countries. India got its first consignment of energy of crude oil using national currency, dirham, rupee trading arrangement. Also, we know that how India is going to establish an IIT in Abu Dhabi that will be part of the IIT Delhi campus. Both countries are also working under a multilateral format known as I2U2, and this was possible only because of Abraham Accords. And now I would like to tell you that the UAE also holds the largest number of Indians outside of India. The largest diaspora anywhere in the world is in UAE. So the consular section of the Indian embassy is always busy with a lot of the issues they are facing. But essentially, as India and UAE relationship grows, the focus will be on substantive engagement and how UAE can be hub for India, not only in terms of connectivity, but also in terms of trade. Remember, India and UAE have signed a trading pact as well, which has been going well, and focus is that how this trading pact opens opportunities for Indian investor for the wider region as well. But by and large, it's the people-to-people relationship between the two countries that has been much celebrated point. In fact, it's said that Dubai is the best run Indian city sometimes as well. That basically points out to the number of Indians in that city. But all in all, the fact that India invited UAE, which is not a member of G20, to attend this year's G20 proceedings shows